Hey there, my name is Andrew. I am one of the pastors on staff here, and we are in week 4 of our message series, Big Questions. And today we're asking the question, why is there suffering? And it's a question that I believe, if answered well, can actually help us to see God's character and faithfulness in an incredibly compelling way. So, let's dive in. And I think a good place for us to start is looking at a couple of potential answers to the suffering question. These are answers that many people throughout history have offered for answering this suffering question. So let's see if any of these answers bear weight. So the first potential answer to the suffering question is that it is God's will. But we get a pretty clear picture of God's will in the Bible. In Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. We drop down to verse 27, still in chapter 1. We read, God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. And then finally, verse 31, we read, God saw all that he made, and it was very good. So, God designed all things to be good in the beginning, but we know how the story goes. Humanity chose to rebel against the God who created them and decided that their own way of living was better than what God had envisioned. In almost an instant, God's creation was corrupted. Evil entered into the world. And the suffering that we experience today is a symptom of that evil. And you may say, well, suffering still happens and God's not stopping it, so doesn't that mean that it's God's will? Not exactly. You see, suffering sprung from the evil that was ushered into creation by humanity's decision to turn away from God. It wasn't God's will that that would happen, but it was God's will to give humanity the free will that would make possible that decision to turn away from him. So, for suffering to not exist, God would have to eliminate all free will from the world. And that's something he's not willing to do. Why? Well, because that would change a lot about the world, and because he wants our full hearts. He wants love to be the motivating factor for our relationship with him, and that wouldn't happen without free will. So, is it God's will that we suffer? Most likely, no. Another potential answer is that everything happens for a good reason. I believe that in some, perhaps many cases, that can be true. The Bible actually talks quite a lot about the goodness that may come out of suffering. A well-known example is found in Romans 5:5. It says this, we also glory in our sufferings because we know that suffering produces perseverance, perseverance character, and character hope. So here, the Apostle Paul makes it clear that suffering can actually form our souls in a way that produces good and tangible qualities such as perseverance, character, and hope. And we have also all heard of stories of people, who do incredible things because of the suffering they endured. And those things are good, no doubt. But still, there are others who experience suffering who would say that no observable goodness has come out of it. So, is goodness a sufficient reason for suffering? Perhaps, perhaps not. One more potential answer is, I caused it. Suffering exists because I cause it for myself. In John 9, Jesus actually addresses this. In verses 1-3, we read, as he went along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Neither this man nor his parents sinned, Jesus said, but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. So in that verse, Jesus squashes the idea that this man's sin or his family's sin caused the suffering that he was experiencing. It's tough to say that God uses suffering as punishment. There's much more evidence in the Bible that points to the fact that God is actually quick to forgive and to show mercy through Jesus. However, that isn't to say that when we live outside of God's will for our lives, against the way he created life to be, we won't have the natural consequences of brokenness, pain, and discomfort. It's likely that we will. So, do we cause our own suffering? Oftentimes, no. but other times it's possible. So, how far have we gotten in answering this question, why is there suffering? Not very far. Of the common ways to answer the question we've looked at, none of them really provide a solid explanation that we can bank our lives on. And maybe, just maybe, that's the way it's supposed to be. Consider the biblical character Job. Now, Job was a righteous man who God looked at as a faithful servant. But then, through no fault of his own, Job experienced inconceivable suffering. And of course, through his experience, Job wanted to know why. So he asked God a series of questions like, why is this happening to me? And what did I do to deserve this? But through all that, God didn't tell him why. Not out of ignorance, not out of carelessness. Instead, God just helps Job to see that neither he nor anyone else has the sheer ability to comprehend the dealings of God, and that includes suffering. Job agrees, saying in Job 42, 2-3, I know that you can do all things, talking about God. No purpose of yours can be thwarted. You asked, who is this that obscures my plans without knowledge? Surely I spoke of things I did not understand, things too wonderful for me to know. The cosmic dynamic between God's goodness and the world's suffering is something that we may never fully understand. And that's okay. According to God himself, that's how it's supposed to be. But we're not leaving the issue there. Because while we can't say with certainty why there's suffering in the world, there are a couple things we do know with certainty. And the first thing is that God himself knows what it's like to suffer. You heard that right. God didn't leave humanity in the world in our suffering. Instead, he willingly subjected himself to the same suffering in order that he may redeem it. Jesus came to the world from the glory of heaven and subjected himself to suffering. We don't know why suffering exists in the world, but what we are absolutely sure of is that God doesn't shy away from it. So the next time that you feel alone in your suffering or wonder, why is this happening to me? Remember, you're not alone. Jesus understands and he will guide you through. Something else we know for certain about suffering is that God will work for good even out of bad. Romans 8:28 says, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. Notice how this verse doesn't say in some things or in positive things. No, Paul makes it clear. He says in all things, God works for the good of those who love him. And that includes the moments of your life that are full of suffering. God has the power to redeem and to renew the parts of you that have been crushed by the suffering you experience. And with him, when you lean on him and rely on him, he will guide you to a place of inner flourishing, full of joy, hope, and a peace that surpasses all understanding. Do you believe that? Do you believe that God will use what was meant for evil in your life and turn it into something beautiful? You can trust him for that. Hold him to his promise and see how he moves. Ed Lee saw the power of God at work in the midst of his suffering. Check out his story.
My name is Ed Lee. I'm a member of Crossroads Church, and I've got a story that I want to share with you. When I was at my regular doctor's visit, which I do twice a year, he noticed that I was down, depressed perhaps, and asked me if there's anything going on in my life that he may not be aware of. And I told him, yes, my wife has cancer, I'm going blind, and my son is dying. My wife's cancer had been operated on 3 times before, and it was declared incurable. And the chance of radiology having any effect was almost non-existent. But that was the only route we had to go, so that's what she did. She went into the radiology treatments once a week or so. My own situation is macular degeneration. It's a gradual going blind, is what it amounts to. My son Brian has ALS, which you may know as Lou Gehrig's disease. It does away with any control you have of your muscles. It gets to the point where you can't talk, you can't swallow, you can't, well, I'm not going to go through the end of it. You get the impression of what I'm talking about. I spent half a day every day, 5 or 6 days a week at his bedside, in effect watching my son go away. We would talk politics or sports or watch TV or the things that generally you do when you're visiting with someone you love. And we prayed. That was a daily thing also. Brian had never been baptized, and I take blame for that. I had jerked him and the rest of the family around the country building my career. I had been after him for some time to get baptized, but in fact I hadn't gone back into a church myself. The suggestion that I get a hold of Pastor Sean to come and baptize Brian came to me through one of my wife's daughters. So he came to my son's home and he baptized my son Brian. On January 4th of this year, at 11 a.m., Brian left us and went to God. I have to tell you that it just ripped the heart right out of my chest. Rage, pain, times 10. It affected me so bad that for a couple of days, I really don't have a good memory of what went on for those couple of days. I've come to realize that God didn't just take Brian away from us, from me. He rescued him. Brian's in heaven. He's in paradise. Do I miss him? You bet. Do I love him? You bet. But he's happy. He's living with Jesus. He's living at the foot of God. And for that, I'm so happy for him. As to the rest of the beginning of the story, my wife went through the radiation. We found that not only had the tumor stopped growing, but in fact it had shrunk. She's back to being the social butterfly that she always was. My vision has not gotten worse, and it's important to say it that way because it is a progressive thing. So the story started tough. I don't know that I'll ever get over losing my son, but you've heard all the very positive things that have come out of the situation. Don't understand how or why he does things? Don't need to. He's God.
Why is there suffering? We can't fully be sure. But when it comes to suffering, here's one thing that the God of the Bible offers in abundance, more so than any other worldview: hope. The God that we follow is the exclusive God who rose from the dead, meaning that we believe there is a power of goodness and love that transcends even death itself. That's hope. We may not have all of the answers, but we have the important ones. Our God is good. Suffering will end, and there is a reason to hope.